I don't know what perspective I am going to bring to this discussion. I don't know what is this so-called Indian perspective that is becoming very much problematic for me. The more and more I read about India and also Indian diaspora. Let me begin by thanking Mr. Rajendra Kharge and Rubin Gauricharan for the honor that has been bestowed upon me to come here and give a lecture on some aspect of Indian diaspora which they thought needs some attention. So, I was given the liberty of articulating the topic the way I choose. I was very ambitious, as most academicians are. I gave him a title, Theorizing the Indian Diaspora, Beyond Persistence and Change. When I started writing the paper, I discovered I was being too ambitious on two counts. One, I was not going to cover the entire Indian diaspora. Two, I was not going to theorize. There was just an attempt being made. So, I wrote a letter to Sharmini indicating, please change, if the program is not finalized, please change the title to Towards Theorizing the Old Indian Diaspora. The latter part would remain. So, you will have to bear with me and put up with my humility, humbling experience in writing this paper. I will begin with a quotation from Naipaul. He said, I think that through scholarship and intelligent inquiry, we will understand more about the past and more about the culture of our grandfathers than they themselves did. It is a very ordinary looking statement. He made this statement introducing the symposium on East Indians in the Caribbean. That was the first ever conference on Indian diaspora held anywhere in the world. It was held at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus in Trinidad in June 1975. If you keep that as some sort of a marker, 1975, and the plea for doing serious scholarly work on this subject, it is now 42 years. And taking stock of what has been written on Indian diaspora in the last 42 years, if not more, you will find diaspora has emerged itself as a separate study. Scholars have covered practically all the Indian communities in the diaspora. Today it will be very difficult for us to find out which community in the diaspora has not been studied. Those constituting large and significant sections of the population, as well as small and insignificant minorities. Those whose ancestors migrated during the colonial times, mostly as indentured laborers, and those who migrated since India's independence, including those who have migrated in the last 3 decades of the globalization era. Scholars have covered almost all institutions, belief systems, and socio-cultural practices. They have examined the changing economic and political fortunes, or in some cases misfortunes, of these communities. The study of Indian diaspora has been uniquely enriched by perspectives rooted in the location of scholars. This is a point which I will repeatedly emphasize wherever I speak on this subject. What are the different perspectives that come from? We have in this conference at least 3 perspectives represented. One perspective is missing. I wish that was also included. The first perspective is from the respective diasporic communities. We have Doyen of Diasporic Studies, respected Professor Brijlal, coming from within diaspora and reflecting on that. There are umpteen number of scholars, and my own mentor in Trinidad was Brinsley Samaru. Now, he himself is from the diasporic, you see, community. Then those from other communities in the diaspora, people who are themselves diasporic but studying Indians, such, you see, studies, you see, are also there. My former colleague Selvin Ryan in University of West Indies used to write on Indians. Those from India, people like me, and those from elsewhere in the world. A reference was made to Gillian, Martin Klaas, Neoffs, Stephen Waltovec, a host, you see, of others. All of us from different perspectives have brought our subject expertise, our insights in unraveling the complex phenomenon of, see, the Indian diaspora. Notwithstanding the rich and growing body of literature on the Indian diaspora, theorizing it has remained a challenge. To start with, the Indian diaspora is not a homogeneous phenomenon. Rubin showed, you see, the book that was, you see, the product of a seminar that was held in Bangalore several years back, which focused attention on the diversities in the Indian diaspora and what it means, you see, to engage with, you see, that phenomenon. The diversity is explained by the period of the initial immigration of the Indians abroad and also by the nature of their immigration. Furthermore, history is evidence to the fact that the economic, political, social, and cultural experiences of the immigrant Indians in the country of their settlement have been varied. Obviously, the diversities that Indian diaspora has thrown up prevent any attempt at generalization without too many qualifications. We'll have to add too many provisos if you want to speak about diaspora in general terms. The study of Indian diaspora now confronts a dilemma similar to the one that Robert Moulton found sociology confronting in the mid-19th century. The dilemma was, there is abundance of detailed orderly descriptions of particulars that are not generalized at all. This is, on the one hand, you see, we have that. Lot of ethnographic, you see, information that is available. On the other hand, general theories which are too remote from particular classes. So we have on the one extreme general theories which do not seem to back up any empirical data. On the other hand, we have arrived at lot of empirical work. There have not been, you see, theorization. This was, you see, the dilemma that sociology confronted. As a way out of this dilemma, Moulton recommended middle range theories which deal with limited aspects of social phenomena. In seeking to theorize the dynamics of the Indian diaspora, I choose to pitch it at the middle range, focusing on the so-called old Indian diaspora, which has been in existence for more than 180 years since its ancestors originally left subcontinental India. Though I draw on the literature on the old Indian diaspora, much of what I articulate are insights that I have gained from fieldwork in Trinidad during my 3-year sojourn at the University of the West Indies from 1994, 95, 96, and the updating that I have done during the 3 short subsequent visits in 2006, 2014, and this year 2017. Before I engage with the main theme of this lecture, a brief digression on the distinction between the new and the old Indian diaspora is in order. This distinction is adapted from the distinction between the new and the old immigrants made by Arthur Helwig to draw attention to the stream of well-educated migrants of Asian origin entering Australia, Canada, and the United States of America. The new immigrant, according to Helwig, is characterized as a person with a bachelor's degree and or better has a professional, managerial, technical, administrative or business occupation. More important, the new immigrant exhibits behavioral patterns that differ from old migrant groups on which current literature and theory is based. The new Indian diaspora is mostly constituted by the voluntary migration of professionals and semi-professionals to industrially advanced countries like Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America, called as brain drain. Although there was a trickle of this migration even during the colonial era, it gathered momentum only after India's independence in 1947, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, and has assumed phenomenal proportions in the globalization era. In this context, would not go into another stream of migration from India to the Middle East for the simple reason these people are only sojourners there. They cannot settle down. Most, you see, Middle Eastern countries have laws against allowing expat communities settling down. They cannot be called diasporic communities. Thanks to the tremendous improvement in international travel and the revolution in information and communication technologies, these Indians have been in continuous connectivity, both physical and virtual, with their homeland. Their diasporic existence is characterized by this connectivity, which is constrained neither by time nor distance. As such, the application of the term diaspora to these communities would itself be problematic. They, therefore, are kept out of the purview of this lecture. The ancestors of the old Indian diasporic communities, which are the focus of the instant lecture, immigrated to the colonies, the British Guyana, Ceylon, Fiji, Jamaica, Malaya, Mauritius, Natal, and Trinidad, the French, Guadeloupe and Martinique, and the Dutch, Suriname, mostly as indentured plantation labor. Their immigration was sponsored, regulated, and supervised by the British colonial authorities. Although there was a provision for the return to India on completion of their period of indenture, many of them did not, return. Only about 20% of them returned to India. Why they stayed back, has a very long, explanation, which I don't propose to go into. To escape from the post-colonial repression of their community and its interests, there was an exodus of the diasporic Indians from some colonies. For example, Indo-Guyanese to Canada and to the United States of America, and Hindustani Surinamis to the Netherlands. Colonialism not only induced this indentured labor migration to the colonies, it also facilitated the migration of Indians to Great Britain, Canada, and to some African countries. They were members of the trading communities from Gujarat and Punjab, who mainly went to South Africa and to East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, and from South India to Southeast Asia, are laborers working on the construction of railroads in East Africa. These immigrants were not sponsored by the colonial regime. They paid for their passage, and they were not bound by any contract. To escape from the post-colonial repression of their community and their interest, there was an exodus of the diasporic Indians from East Africa to England and Canada. The descendants of these two streams of immigrants from the Indian subcontinent in the colonial era today constitute the fourth, fifth, and succeeding generation of settlers. Of these, the communities forged out of indentured laborers represent a substantial segment of the Indian diaspora. Many of these communities have celebrated the sesquicentenary of the arrival of the first Indians in the settlement country. It is the evolution of these communities in the diaspora that is the substance of the remainder of this lecture. The metaphorical Girmitya Gatri or Jahaji bundle. In the lingo of the members of the old diaspora, the indentured laborers were referred to as Girmityas, literally those who signed the indentured agreement. Since they traveled from Calcutta, now Kolkata, or Madras, now Chennai, in India, to the colonies in Jahaj, they were called Jahajis. These indigent Jahajis carried their worldly belongings, usually wrapped in cloth and slung over their shoulders or carried on their head. This baggage of theirs was called Girmityas Gatri in Suriname, or Jahaji bundle in Trinidad. Besides their worldly belongings, metaphorically, they also carried a socio-cultural guttery or bundle, which consisted of such social institutions as religion, caste and family, and cultural elements as language, music, art, dress, cuisine, etc., often in the folk form and in their regional variants. Much of the academic engagement of the anthropologists and sociologists, as also some historians, especially in the initial stages, was with what has happened to this socio-cultural baggage which the ancestors of specific diasporic communities brought with them to the colonies. Scholars researching on the social institutions and cultural practices among different diasporic communities have generally sought a categorical answer to the question of whether or not a particular social institution or a cultural practice originally brought into the colony exists there. For example, given the intrinsic relationship between caste and Hinduism, scholars have tried to show that it has survived among some diasporic communities, changed in others, and to have become moribund in the rest. I have in mind a 1967 classic on this subject edited by Barton Schwartz. For anybody doing research, you see, on this subject, this is a primer that must be referred to. They have sought to explain these differences by the variations in the historical and other circumstances of Hindus in the diaspora. The two theses are two hypotheses dialectic, persistence and change. Such analysis of the social institutions and cultural practices among diasporic communities invariably posit an ideal type of those institutions and elements such as was supposed to have existed in the past or as it exists in India today. Accordingly, in the writings of such scholars, we can discern two distinct strands, one emphasizing persistence or retention. I think a reference was made to Martin Class in the morning. His book is a classic instance of the persistence and retention argument. And the other, you see, of change. I specifically refer to the ideal typical case of a scholar, Joseph Nevadomsky. He did not write, you see, a book, but he published 4 important papers on his work, you see, in Trinidad, Joseph Nevadomsky. They marshal selective data on village social structure, religious beliefs and practices, caste system, family patterns and kinship forms, etc., to make the case for their hypothesis. The problem with both these hypotheses is that their point of reference, the ideal typical notion of India and the Indian, is presumed to have remained unchanged. This holds well for the diasporic imagination of the civilizational India, but not the existential India, which is characterized by diversity and change in its social institutions and cultural practices since the time the diasporic ancestors left the country. Viewed thus, the India that the diasporics have in mind itself needs to be problematized. In this context, it is important to note that the boundary of what is called India has not remained the same even during the last 100 years. Thus, for those who left India before partition in 1947 and their descendants, the reference point is the subcontinental India, which includes the present-day Pakistan and Bangladesh. Whereas for those living India after partition, it is the political state of India as it exists, say, now. For many who experienced partition, the reference point is often ambivalent. I have elsewhere analyzed the implications of this for the old diasporic community's orientation to India. And the paper that I am referring to is a paper titled The Social Construction of the Other Indian. What happens in the diaspora, I give a characteristic instance there. When the Pakistani team went and played in Guyana and they defeated the West Indies, you see, team, the spectators carried around Indian tricolor. And Imran Khan, who was the captain, did not know why they are celebrating Indian with the Indian flag. they did not have a Pakistani flag perhaps. Or their imagination, the supporters were all Indians. And I have been repeatedly told, you say, in Trinidad, when I pass through, you see, immigration or customs, don't go to an Indian immigration officer or customs officer, go to a black. Why? They told me, an Indian has to prove more Trinidadian than, you say, a black Trinidadian. So he will try to show his loyalty to the country most by examining your back. So there are several such anecdotal, you see, things. I use the phenomenological approach, talking, you see, to people and, you see, doing, you see, that. But that is, you see, not a serious thing, you see, in this context. It is insightful that in a comparative study of rituals and festivals in Trinidad and parts of India, Satnarayan Balkaran Singh refers to India as the grandmother country. It's a very important, you say, insight in that. In the course of the first 2 or 3 generations of Indian immigrants in Trinidad, as elsewhere in the old diaspora, India was the mother country. For the present generation of Indo-Trinidadians, Trinidad is the mother country. In fact, for all members of the old diaspora who have been doubly displaced and twice banished, it is the country that they left which is the point of reference as mother country. It does not mean that they have lost touch with India, but the point of reference, you see, changes. Another problem with the persistence versus change dialectic is that it leaves little or no scope for the agency of the diasporic community and for the diasporic imagination to adapt, adopt, and innovate its social institutions and cultural practices, depending upon the internal and the external challenges which it has been constrained to confront. This is all the more significant considering that the recruitment under indentured immigration to the sugar colonies consisted of single persons, not families or groups from single villages, as in the case of immigration to Burma, Ceylon, and Malaya. Somebody made reference to the Kangani system in the afternoon, you see, session, Maestri system, you see, to Burma. They mostly belonged to indigent sections of rural population of British India, and they were illiterate with very little cultural capital of the so-called great tradition. What they carried in their cultural guttery or bundle was memories and intangible fragments of the little tradition, to which, you see, a reference was made by Professor Bridlal in the morning. Considering the long distance from their homeland, the enormous time that took them to travel to the colonies, and the absence of efficient and inexpensive communication facilities between the colonies and the British India, their relationship with their mother country was tenuous, if any. Those days, on an average, it is said it took about 100 days for the journey, you see, to make. You can imagine if the letter traveled by, you see, ship, how long it would take, and if it's somebody illiterate, somebody else would write for that, somebody else had to get that letter read and respond, etc. How difficult it could have been. So this is quite different from the modern time, wherein I am in constant touch, we see, with my family over internet and WhatsApp and several other, you say, media. As Balkaran Singh observes, each arriving individual was a microcosm of the macrocosm that was India and its existing culture during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Drawing from their individual and collective memories, and against all odds, as a subject population, they reconstituted their social institutions and cultural practices and evolved as a diasporic community. People who migrated as individual persons constituted, you see, communities. As Peter Manuel observes, is quoted by Balkaran Singh, what exists now are not simple transplants or degraded versions of that of the mother country. They are distinctive entities, often with original and dynamic forms. To me, as a sociologist, the articulation of Indo-Trinidadian as distinctive and vibrant identity in a socio-cultural context that was ethnically uncongenial and antagonistic is a remarkable cultural, socio-cultural achievement. I think that is something that I would like to recognize and emphasize and tell people, if you look at the background from which you see these people went, the way you see they went as single individuals to evolve as communities and reconstruct. It is easy for us to see what is surviving, persistence or change, but to me what is more important is that they constituted a community at all. Somebody made a reference, you see, to this. They expected that when you are taken there, they will just become whatever you see else, but not you see Indians, that they will never get you see constituted as a community. That is a remarkable cultural achievement. Now, in understanding the evolution of this unique hybrid or hyphenated identity that is indicative of both persistence and change, but neither of them exclusively, that I find metamorphosis to be a useful analytical device. In my exploration of the dynamics of social institutions and cultural practices of the Indo-Trinidadians during the last 23 years, I have found the persistence versus continuity antithesis to be unhelpful. To say in a matter-of-fact fashion that some institutions and practices have persisted and some have changed is not to say much. It does not explain the dynamics of the phenomenon on hand. In fact, such an antithesis as the guiding principle is not only narrows down the scope of our study of the social institutions and cultural practices of the diasporic community, but also distorts their understanding and clouds their fascinating nuances. Alternatively, I have found the concept of metamorphosis to be an instructive heuristic device for the study of the dynamics of social institutions and cultural practices in the old diaspora. I have borrowed this, you see, from the realm of biology. I will not go into the etymology part of it. I will just, you see, mention adapting a biological concept in a sociological analysis invokes the organic analogy. One should, of course, be cautious about the possible reification and homologizing that this analogy may lead to. What the biological concept of metamorphosis suggests sociologically is explained by Peter Medawar, Nobel laureate in medicine, a more or less radical rearrangement of parts that occurs in the development of those animals of which the embryonic or larval forms differ greatly from the corresponding adult forms. In the case of the old diaspora, the socio-cultural guttery or bundle that individual immigrants brought with them undergoes a profound change in form from the time of their arrival in the colony to the time they emerge in the new habitat as a community with a unique identity. That is new, and notwithstanding some similarities, can hardly be traced in its essence to their motherland. The concept of metamorphosis as applied to the dynamics of social institutions and cultural practices in the old diaspora is represented in figure 1. If you look at the diagram, it is a property space which has been divided into 4 cells based on 2 axes. This yields us 4 different situations, L1, T1. The reference is 19th and early 20th century, majorly North India, especially Bhojpur region, that is present day western Bihar and eastern Uttar Pradesh, minorly South India, especially Madras Presidency and present day Tamil Nadu. That was, you see, the locale which we are speaking of in that time. L1, T2, that is India today, which has in the meantime has undergone partition of the subcontinent and independence of the country, unification of princely states which were not part of the British Empire, or they were only under indirect, you see, rule, and French colonies, and the liberation and accession of Goa in 1962, and beyond. You can trace it, including accession, you see, of Sikkim, which took place, you see, much later. So, India today, which we are speaking of, refers to this India, not you see the India of the 19th and early 20th century, with major focus on Bhojpur in the north and to some extent Madras Presidency in the south. If you shift you see to L2 T1, that is the time when the immigration took place, there are colonies at the time of indentured immigration of Indians. The period extends from 1834 to 1917 formally, and Trinidad from 1845 to 1917. From the time the first ship Fath al-Razak took them you see there to the last one, SS Ganges, was the last ship you see to land there. L2 T2 is colonies after independence at various you see times and as they exist you see now. And my reference here is to Trinidad 1962 to 2017. Analyzing the dynamics, analyzing this dynamics necessarily involves comparison. The conceptual frameworks developed by sociologists to analyze social change in India, that is L1 T1 to L2 T2, whether the change is planned or unplanned, endogenous or exogenous, have little or no significance in understanding the dynamics of an old diaspora community. I refer to you see the works of M.N. Srinivas, etc. You cannot just you see apply those ideas in the context of Indians anywhere else. They are relevant you see to understanding India, what is happening in social change there, but not you see here. Comparing the old diaspora today, L2 T2, with what exists in India today, L1 T2, is invidious. You cannot just compare. Also problematic is comparing the old diaspora community, L2 T2, with what is supposed to have existed in India at the time of initial migration. I think there is a lot of contestation on that, and there is repeated you see demand for detailed inquiry you see on this you see issue. It is in this context that I introduce the idea of socio-cultural metamorphosis, some illustrations. Obviously, all existing social institutions and cultural practices of the old diaspora communities can be subjected to metamorphosis analysis from social and cultural reproductive institutions and practices like family, marriage, kinship, life cycle rituals, and socialization, through belief systems, value framework, identity mediating institutions like religion and caste, to everyday life sustaining systems like food and language. Such an exercise is beyond the scope of the instant lecture. Given the immensity of and complexity of the dynamics under reference, it is the subject of a longish volume, if not for several volumes. Currently, I am working you say on my Trinidad data of the last 23 years, putting it in this analytical framework. I did not want to write one more ethnographic you see descriptive account. Here, I confine myself to giving a few illustrative cases of socio-cultural metamorphosis of East Indians to Trinidad Indians to Indo-Trinidadians. An important facet of metamorphosis among the diasporic Indians in the Caribbean has been the development of what Stephen Wertowek calls a generally unitary Hindu religion. Although there are multiplicity of organizations representing the religious interests of Hindus, the division of people on the basis of traditional sects like Shaivism and Vaishnavism, and schools of philosophy like Advaita, Dvaita, etc., is conspicuous by its absence. As David Lowenthal observes, Hinduism in the Caribbean is a simpler and more homogeneous creed than in India. Simplification and standardization of rituals and the strong impact of Christianity on the structure and functioning of Hinduism in the Caribbean sets it apart from Hinduism as practiced in India and in the new Indian diaspora. Not surprisingly, in his comparative study of rituals and festivals in Trinidad and India, Balkaran Singh finds notable differences. One particular aspect of the metamorphosis of Hinduism in Trinidad that deserves special attention is the role of Hindu religious organization. Brinsley Samaru and Sherry Ann Singh, Sherry Ann Singh is here, have drawn attention to the adaptation that Hindu organizations underwent in Trinidad. The Hindu community leaders organized themselves both at the local level and the national level, the latter assisting the immigrants to adjust to the new society. The role played by the Sanatana Dharma Mahasabha, SDMS, is particularly noteworthy. This is quite unlike its counterparts in India or in the new Indian diaspora, including the Akhil Bharatiya Hindu Mahasabha, which has very little influence on mainstream politics in India. In India, Hindus constitute the overwhelming majority, whereas in Trinidad, they are a small minority. The context in which the trends in the organization of Hindus is meaningful is aptly summarized by Satyanarayan Maharaj, General Secretary of SDMS, as follows. We must always understand that we are 350,000 Hindus here. We are in the Western world and we are surrounded by 700 million people of the Christian faith and different patterns of culture. Among Indians in the West Indies, according to Lowenthal, religion is the principal focus for expression of ethnic identity. While this is understandable in the case of Hindus and Muslims, it appears to be true even among a community of people converted to Christian denomination, namely the Presbyterian Church, which belongs to the family of Protestant churches. What is most salient about Presbyterian Church of Trinidad is that it is almost exclusively an Indian church. With nearly 95% of the membership of this church being Indo-Trinidadians, it is often referred to as the East Indian Church, and the members of this church are dubbed by some as till yesterday Hindus. The metamorphosis resulting in this unique identity between the church, Presbyterianism, and the community of converts to it, Indo-Trinidadians, is explained by the fact that they were offered Christianity in a way more acceptable, you see, to them. That is, conversion to Presbyterianism did not explicitly violate their ethnic identity. Presbyterianism was, in fact, remarkably sensitive to the ethnic identity of the Indian converts. We do not have a parallel to this in the Indian diaspora or even in India. The discussion on caste among diasporic Hindus is often phrased in terms of persistence versus change hypothesis. Elsewhere, I have argued that the question of the existence or otherwise of the phenomenon of caste among Trinidad Hindus is too complex to have a categorical answer. My analysis reveals that, in tune with the institutionalization of a homogenized Hinduism, what Vertovec calls a unitary system is the evolution of a polarized Varna model. The structural elements of the original system have been replaced by a set of downward cultural attributes and upward economic attributes, which have served to strengthen the knowledge of degree, as Michael Angrosino calls it. The positions of Brahmins and Chamars as the poles remain unchanged, but between these two, there is an informal system of determining degree based on values and are relevant and meaningful in the new socio-economic setup. Caste, it must be emphasized, has no relevance to the structure of the wider society in Trinidad, and it has been dissolved as a functional socio-economic form. However, it continues to exist as the Hindus maintain a systematic method of reckoning ideal ranking within the social hierarchy. Even when the potential for individual mobility is great, family identification remains stable. Thus, what we see among Trinidad Hindus is the transformation from caste as a structural principle to caste as a socio-cultural idiom. My insights on the social and cultural life of the diasporic existence of Indians in Trinidad have been enriched by adopting the metamorphosis lens. In reviewing the literature on the Indian diaspora too, I use this lens. The performance of the Ram Leela, I think again Sherian Singh's work, and also Balkaran Singh and Guptar. The celebration of Hindu festivals of Diwali, Shivratri, Pagwa, and the rituals associated with Jhandi, the flag. The celebration of Hose, an originally Shia Muslim commemorative event. Food items, for example, something called as the doubles. Those who are familiar with Trinidad know doubles. There is a recent book on this subject by Dean. Art forms, for example, chutney songs, the reconstitution of family and patriarchy, the funerary rites. There are several subjects to see which one could review from this lens. In conclusion, historically, the socio-cultural baggage carried by the immigrants from India during the 19th and the early 20th centuries inevitably encountered forces of change in their new settlements in the British, Dutch, and French colonies. These forces are characteristic of the very nature of the diaspora and the changing politico-economic and socio-cultural context within which the diasporic community found itself. If the bearing of the institution on the social organization of the diasporic community is tenuous and the forces of change are strong, an institution became infirm and attenuated. However, if the institution is an integral part of the community, even if the forces of change initially deconstitute it, it will get reconstituted. The reconstitution, however, will not be a return to the past, even if some elements are apparently found to be persisting or retained. As the concept of metamorphosis suggests, the institutions and practices will undergo changes both in their form and content. On the one hand, the process of transformation reveals the resilience and mutability of the institution or the practice, as well as the nature of adaptation it undergoes. On the other, it will elucidate the nature and operating conditions of the institution and the practice. Thus, in studying a diasporic community, especially in the old Indian diaspora, it is more advantageous to focus on the metamorphosis of its social institutions than to seek to resolve the persistence versus change conundrum. The focus on socio-cultural metamorphosis frees one from the need to synchronically compare the diasporic community with its highly localized counterpart in the ancestral land. It is true that such a comparison may offer some analytical insights. However, one must be careful in making such synchronic comparisons, for the ancestral society itself has undergone changes over a period of time. Such a comparison can only show how a given social institution has fared in two different situations, the ancestral and the diasporic. It cannot tell us how and how far it has changed in the diaspora. Only a study of metamorphosis can shed light on these questions. The thrust of this lecture on the socio-cultural dynamics in the old Indian diaspora is well encapsulated in the Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore's banyan tree analogy and its elucidation by Hugh Tinker. Tagore said, "To study a banyan tree, you not only must know its main stem in its own soil, but also must trace the growth of its greatness in the further soil, for then you can know the true nature of its vitality." The civilization of India, like the banyan tree, has shed its beneficent shade away from its own birthplace. India can live and grow by spreading abroad, not the political India, but the ideal India. Tinker's elucidation is here. He says, the banyan tree has thrust down roots in soil which is stony, sandy, marshy, and has somehow drawn sustenance from diverse, unpromising conditions. Yet the banyan tree itself has changed. Its similarity to the original growth is still there, but it has changed in response to its different environment. Thank you.